Good afternoon, and welcome to this online discussion with Swedish commentator and social historian Lars Trägårdh, focusing on the ongoing response in Sweden to the coronavirus. This program is produced and presented by the ASF, American Scandinavian Foundation. It is a follow-up discussion to the May 9th webinar with Dr. Trägårdh, also produced by ASF. This is one of many online programs produced and presented by ASF while our headquarters Scandinavia House, the Nordic Center in America, is temporarily closed because of the ongoing restrictions in place in New York City due to the coronavirus pandemic. A full listing of these programs can be found at our website, scandinaviahouse.org, as well as in our weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for on scandinaviahouse.org. I am Edward Gallagher, President of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome Dr. Trägårdh, a former fellow of the ASF, who has received 2 grants for his research in the United States. Lars has had a distinguished career in both Sweden and the US, having received a doctorate from UC Berkeley in 1993. He has held faculty positions at Barnard College and Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Europe, as well as at Sweden's University of Linköping and Södertörn University College. Lars has frequently appeared as a commentator on Swedish radio and television. He has also written extensively for a number of publications in Sweden and throughout Europe. He is the author of the book, Is Sweden Human? Community and Independence in Modern Sweden, soon to be published in the United States. Welcome, Lars. A great deal has happened. Good to see you. It's been 4 months since we last met, and a great deal has happened in Sweden and throughout the world with regard to the coronavirus. When we last met, Sweden had attracted international attention for its unique and in some ways controversial response to the coronavirus, much different from that of other nations. Whereas many nations went into lockdown, Sweden did not, nor did you require masks. Many other measures were not employed, and it created a great deal of interest. Now, nearly 7 months after the first reported cases of the virus in Sweden, can you update us on this strategy, its success, its failures, and what the numbers look like today?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was really an incredible outpouring interest in Sweden. I myself and many like me here in Sweden were really inundated with requests from foreign media. It was a fascinating period. I think according to the statistics that the Swedish Institute has gathered, there's never been as much interest in Sweden as during this period. Somewhere towards the end of June, I would say, interest disappeared for a while. I think that there was a kind of a conclusion that media arrived at that Sweden was sort of the ultimate basket case, you know, with a high mortality rate ranking up there in the top as far as the countries with high mortality rates. During the summer, there was relatively little interest. Now, some of that may have had to do with vacation time, but I think it also had to do with that there was a conclusion that the story of Sweden was over. Right, the conclusions had been reached, and that was it. Then, beginning in July, or really in the end of June, we started to see this gradual but very steady decline in infection rates as well as mortality rates. And by now, we're looking at Sweden suddenly looking like the opposite of the basket case here in Europe. And the international media is yet again here knocking on the door, but now the story has sort of switched around because it turns out that the rates here of infection and mortality now are down. It's a much more a flat curve here. Very, very few mortality cases anymore. And this is at the same time, right, that we see a worry about a second wave in the UK, in France, in Spain, even to some extent in the neighboring countries like Denmark and Norway. So now the interest in Sweden is a little bit different. You know, people are starting to think about, does this kind of approach, which was based much more on a kind of a long-term sustainable policy, right? That is to say, avoiding a lockdown, which was deemed to be unsustainable over the long term, not just for economic reasons, but for social reasons, right? You can't close schools down for a really long time without lethal, very, very dangerous consequences for children. And you can't really close down society at large either. So now there's an interest in Sweden that's a little bit different than what you saw earlier on. I think that in some ways here we have to be very careful, because just because things have looked very good in Sweden in this recent month or two, of course, it may change again, right? You know, we may see a second wave coming here as well. So we have to be very careful. You know, I've been trying to say this from the beginning, right? That this is a long haul. This is a story that is not ending, you know, in the near future. We have to be really careful with sort of not grabbing today's numbers to see that as a kind of definitive trend over a longer period of time. But right now, Sweden, you know, is a very calm place. It's a sense of some degree of normality. People are slowly returning, right, to a more ordinary form of social life. People are returning to work. People are still, you know, working a lot from home. Universities are still employing teaching by Zoom, right? So by no means a return to the normality prior to the outbreak. But I would say there is more of a trend towards some kind of return to the life that we had before.
And are restaurants opening, bars, that type of thing? Or have they never been closed, really?
Yeah, exactly. They have never been closed, right? So in that sense, the summer here was very nice because everything was open, and it was sort of, in that sense, business as usual. But people, remember, Sweden chose not, it was not a question of not doing anything. It is that we chose a voluntary approach rather than a command approach. So basically, the Swedish citizens were treated not like children that needed to be sort of reprimanded and told what to do, but the idea was that this was a reciprocal relationship, that everybody had to take some responsibility, and that entailed primarily social distancing. So that, you know, when you stood in line to buy liquor in the liquor store in my small town of Båstad in southern Sweden during the summer, even if it was raining, you know, people were sort of standing outside because you could only be 20 people inside of the liquor store. And this is sort of adorable in a way, but people are very good at following these kinds of instructions, even though there were no sort of threats of fines hanging over their heads. But, you know, the life in that sense, right, is open, right? So restaurants and shops and everything like that, you know, none of that was ever really closed down. But the habits, right, of distancing are still very, very much in place.
And there are limitations, as there always have been, on large gatherings, aren't there? I think.
Yes, absolutely. That was put in place. 50 people was the maximum. And that is actually an interesting question, because there's a lot of pressure coming from particularly the culture sector and the sports sector that are hurting, right, badly. I mean, like small businesses in general having more of a hard time than bigger companies that have been able to handle this pretty well. But the culture sector and the sports sector in particular are hard hit because they are depending on having an audience. You know, you can't have opera with 3 people inside there. You know, it doesn't make any sense, and you can't make any money from it either. So there's a pressure now, and the ideas or the recommendations now are to go up to 500. But this is not a sure thing. I mean, I think Tegnell, you know, who is the head for the Swedish Health Authority, is very concerned, right, about sustainability and the long term here. So there's not a lot of enthusiasm for increasing gatherings at this point, because we're watching what's happening in the rest of Europe, where many countries went from total lockdown to opening up, and then, you know, followed a second wave of infections. And that's the one thing I think we don't want to do here, you know. So we rather keep at, you know, a certain level of voluntary, you know, restrictions and limitations of the sort that you're mentioning for a longer period. But that's really a debate right now. And they're trying to investigate, can you increase the numbers, for example, in sports events, in such a way that you avoid queues outside, that you have a spaced seating inside of an auditorium or a sports arena. So this is partly an engineering problem and a sort of policing problem in terms of keeping order. If those things can be solved, I think we're going to see an increase in the numbers. But this is a tricky problem that I think needs time to find a good solution for it.
What about international travel? Are you allowing people from any country in? Do you require quarantining if they do come in? And are Swedes allowed to go anywhere?
Yeah, well, the Swedes have been, of course, we have not chosen this route of closing borders. And I think we discussed it last time. I mean, there were very strong arguments from people who are sort of experts in the field that closing borders is probably not the most effective way of dealing, with the epidemic. So Sweden hasn't closed borders, but of course, what we have been subject to now is eased up. But both Finland and Norway and Denmark were all closing borders in relationship to Sweden. And that was a cause for a certain amount of conflict, especially in the south of Sweden, where southern Sweden had better rates, than Denmark did on the other side of the Sound. And this is an area which is very integrated, economically, people working in one place, traveling across the water on the bridge and so forth. So people were a little pissed off because Danes would then come over to Sweden to go to the bars and the shops and enjoy the free life in Sweden, where Swedes could not go over to Copenhagen, even though infection rates were higher there than in Sweden. Now, the Danes have changed that. So now, we can move freely between Sweden and Denmark. Norway still have restrictions, but they are going by region. So some Swedish regions are not red listed, others are. Finland, are still, I would say, the most strict, in terms of placing a sort of a full kind of boundary. But even there in the borderlands up in the north, they've opened up for these very economically integrated areas across the border, so people can, move. So we see more pragmatism, Scandinavian pragmatism, to try to come back, to some kind of unity and get away from unnecessary kind of conflicts around these issues.
But the rest of Europe and the United States are allowed free entry into Sweden.
Well, I think in the case of the U.S., there are limitations that are EU dictated, right? Yeah. So I think there is a different matter. Within Europe, I mean, the Swedes are not the sort of the problem in a sense, right? But we have to be careful with what's going on in other countries, and they not. I mean, you don't want to be a situation where you sort of end up leaving one day, arriving, and then 2 days later, there's a new set of rules, right? So in general, people have shown a lot of caution in terms of travel. So, this kind of international travel is not sort of really high on the agenda for most ordinary Swedes in terms of vacations and so forth. This was the big thing this summer here. Everybody stayed in Sweden. And there were special words for it, right? To describe this business about taking a vacation in Sweden. We call it, a vacation in Swedish is semester, and home is hem. So then you coin a new word, hemester, which means that you take your vacation in Sweden. Of course, summer here is pretty nice. So we'll see how happy the Swedes are come February. If they're still denied their vacations in Spain and Portugal.
Winter will make a big difference for all of us, I think, if this continues as it currently is. That's
yes, indeed.
Tell me about testing in Sweden. You were pretty good about testing from the very beginning. You did a lot of nut tests from the very beginning. Is that continuing? Has it become more extensive?
Well, first of all, thank you for suggesting that it was good here in the beginning. I beg to differ. I think it was actually one of the failures here. We were much too slow with with the testing. And I think that's something that we're going to have to do more research. There's a commission right now to try to see, what actually happened, what went right, what went wrong. And testing, along with protecting the elderly, I would say, stand out as the two areas where Sweden did not do very well. Now, on the testing side, things have gotten much, much better. So now, we see very high levels of testing. You can test both for antibodies, and for, having an infection right now. So there are two different types of tests. So now the testing levels are very, very high, and we have much, much more information. And this is, of course, what was missing early on. So right now we are in much better shape in terms of also of what we do. If we do get, so that many people expect that we're going to get cluster outbreaks, maybe not a full-fledged second wave, but few people would be surprised if we get clusters in local areas of outbreaks. And having very good testing then, of course, will allow to do much more in the area of tracing, breaking, infection routes, and try to contain infections within, smaller areas. So right now, that side is also much, much better than it was early on, if we go back to March or April.
And just speaking of clusters, in the United States, we've seen an outbreak with the opening of colleges. Did you see something like that in Sweden, or did colleges close? So there has been a reopening.
Yeah, we closed colleges, and I guess we can call high schools, gymnasium here in Sweden. We were, the preschools and primary schools, up through 9th grade were open, are still open. What we looked at, that's something that's being looked at. The main worry here, right, was in September, or really starting in mid-August, because we open up schools and vacations and in Sweden earlier than it does, let's say, in the rest of Europe. So we had this sort of return, right, to the regular work and school life here already in mid-August. And so people have been watching this very, very carefully to see, will we see new outbreaks right here? It's been relatively little of it. The numbers have been very, very good. What we see now, and this is just the last few days, right? There were reports that what we see as danger signs is actually from the return to team sports, right? Especially hockey, which of course is a big pastime. It's a contact sport. And according to the early analysis, it's not so much the actual games themselves, but it's the locker room scenarios, right? That might be the issue here. So you're absolutely right in asking the question. Like, everybody's concerned about this kind of return now, and then even more so as fall and winter comes along, right? When people are gathering more inside rather than outside. So this is exactly the sort of questions and what we try to keep an eye on in order to prevent, a return to bigger outbreaks.
And has there been any effort to restrain students in efforts to party or anything like that? I know that was one of the phenomena we've seen here. Students get back to school, they want to party, and that
right. We have seen that there was a concern in early August, right? The numbers suggested, right, that the new infections tended to be among, the young. So then you had exactly this discussion. And then there were some events in Norway, in Bergen, among university students. That was a bigger outbreak there. So there is this concern, but it hasn't been really in focus. So I don't think, as far as I know, there hasn't been enough of these to sort of call attention to in the media reporting, right? But that still is an open possibility. This, of course, is one of the areas where people are, concerned, because young people are not vulnerable in the same way. And, you have that argument, which you have in the US as well, that since young people themselves don't feel vulnerable, and they may be tired of, keeping distance, that they might sort of, revert to kind of behavior that could be dangerous. But so far, so good here. We haven't seen much of that yet.
Mm-hmm. Here in the States, there is an enormous interest in the research and hopefully the introduction of a vaccine. Great deal of focus on how soon that can happen. And of course, AstraZeneca is one of the leaders in vaccine research. Does that similar interest exist in Sweden, or is it a little more laid back there vis-a-vis the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, that, you know, it really is. I mean, it's not that people are not interested in vaccines. Of course, everybody realizes that in the longer term, right? That's what everybody hopes for. And Sweden in general has a very good record as far as voluntary vaccination. We don't have a big anti-vax movement, for example, like you have in the US. And
oh, you don't? Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, it's a critical issue, because if you're going to do, I mean, the objective of vaccination ultimately is herd immunity, of course, and that means that a lot of people, you know, have to, you know, voluntarily take the vaccine. So once it's there in place, I think it's going to work fine here. But right now, remember, right, you know, we've chosen an approach that was very criticized early on, but that has a kind of a sustainability to it, right? So that right now, you know, what is happening in Sweden seems to be working pretty well, right? You know, so there isn't a sense of a kind of almost a panicky sense of we need to have a vaccine come now, you know, and we don't have to re-elect Trump in Sweden for November. So there's not that kind of, we're going to have a vaccine before the elections, right? You know, it's a little bit more like, you know, we don't want to have a vaccine until we know it's truly tested and really works. And I don't think anybody here is expecting a vaccine to show up until maybe spring, maybe next summer, but who knows, right? It's too early to tell.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you mentioned herd immunity. Of course, that was talked about a great deal back in the spring. And it was thought, I don't know if this was ever really a correct assumption, but I think many non-Swedes thought that your policies were intended to bring about herd immunity. Any thoughts on that? Because it seems still far in the distance.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the kind of, I think, misunderstandings about Sweden. There were two arguments that unfortunately, American media made a lot of, which, you know, really was never really the objective here. You know, one was that, you know, we, you know, prioritize the economy over, you know, human life. And the second one was that we were sort of going after some herd immunity approach, right? You know, that is not true. It's true that there was a containment approach, right, rather than a suppression approach. And that, you know, that you can then sort of construe, if you want to, as sort of being more close to a herd immunity approach than a suppression approach. But it wasn't really the key objective to begin with. The objectives had more to do with, you know, we wanted to be able to keep schools open, we wanted to be able to keep society open, while, you know, making sure that the healthcare system did not, you know, fall apart, and we wanted to protect the elderly and other vulnerable groups, right? And in Sweden, basically, some worked and some failed in this regard, right? The healthcare system never buckled. With respect to the elderly, there was a failure, which, you know, we discussed last time, and which is now, of course, a subject for very serious kind of studies, how to avoid this if this ever happens again. But herd immunity, it's not a discussion that we've had a whole lot of here. But of course, you measure it now that you have possibility of measuring antibodies, right? You know, we can collect data on it. It's complicated, though. There's been smaller studies of a kind of immunity that is related to T cell. I don't know if you've had this discussion in the US, but the T cell immunity is different, right, from the antibody immunity. And it's much more difficult to actually measure the T cell immunity. But they've done smaller studies in Sweden, you know, where it's, you know, possible to do it in terms of cost and practicalities. And what that appears to show is that even though the immunity in terms of just antibodies is still relatively low, right? If you then factor in the T cell immunity, the levels are higher, right? So one thought is that in some parts of Sweden, for example, in Stockholm, right? You may have, a degree, right, of immunity. Nobody knows exactly what the figure is on that, right? Then on top of that, there's a debate now too about how much immunity is necessary for there to be a kind of effect of this sort, right? If some numbers are very high, people are banding about 70, 80%. Others arguing it's more like 25%. Of course, this matters greatly. And the fact of the matter is that we simply don't really know for sure about it. And I would say nobody here is banking on it, but we're all interested in learning more about it. But right now, the effort is not to bank or bet on herd immunity, but it is trying to make sure that we all keep doing what we've agreed to do, which is namely to use our brains, keep our distance, and try to follow, right, the advice coming from the health authorities. And there's a very high degree of conforming with those recommendations. I mean, it's around 80%. So it's very high, even though it's voluntary.
Very good. 80% are really adhering to. Terrific. Great, great. You mentioned a little earlier economic effects, and that's a big question. Has your strategy been more successful in terms of ensuring that the economy will remain vibrant and vital? How do things look? I know it's a broad question.
Yeah. No, but it's of course the Swedish economists and others are working on this all the time. And I talked to one of a dear friend of mine, Jesper Royne, who's a leading Swedish economist, and he was giving me some numbers about it. And the good news is that the Swedish economy is not doing. I mean, it's doing better, right? Than in general in Europe. But it's not particularly different from, let's say, Norway or Denmark. The Nordic countries in general doing better, right, than the rest of Europe. So you can't say that, Swedish policy had like a kind of a clear positive effect on the economy per se. But it's also true that we're doing reasonably well. Then of course you have to factor in the fact that these are, Nordic welfare states, right? So, you do have this kind of very different type of safety net here. So one thing I can tell you is that there is not in the air, a huge amount of worry about, people losing jobs or becoming unemployed or sort of a collapsing economy. There are complaints in some sectors. I mentioned before, like the cultural sector. There's some of the restaurants and so forth, hotels, people who organize conferences. I mean, so there are areas, right, that are particularly airlines, huge, right? What is going to happen with SAS or Norwegian, and what's going to happen to airports, right? So I must say that there are not big problems and potential issues here. There are indeed, but it's not. I would say at this point, most of the economists are suggesting actually now that things are better than expected. Right? There was an anticipation of a much worse economic fallout. Some of the assistance programs that were put in place have not even been used, right? So
really?
So it is a sort of a mixed picture here. There are pockets that are doing poorly, other areas are doing much better, right? So it depends on sort of how your business operates in a kind of environment, of social distancing. Right? So conferences and hotels don't do as well as people who are working in the IT sector, for example. So, I mean, all of that, it's just common sense in a way.
And you don't have the national anxiety about high unemployment rates, which is so prevalent here, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
unemployment really been controlled. Very good. Very good. We have a few questions here. Would you like to take a few questions from our listeners? Or
absolutely.
The first one we have here is, what does the research show on pediatric cases in Sweden in terms of severity, recovery, rate of transmission, and post-recovery health status?
I missed the first part there, Ed, if you can repeat that.
What does the research show on pediatric cases in Sweden in terms of severity, recovery, rate of transmission, and post-recovery health status?
So you're talking about children?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, we haven't had any fatalities of in this age group up to 19, right? So there hasn't been a whole lot of concern over it. Of course, this is a hugely important question because, as you well know, in the US, you have a very big debate around school openings, right? And concerns about that. It has led to, I think, a pretty tortured debate around the schools. And one of the unfortunate aspects, right, about the way that sort of Sweden, was debated and discussed, right, in international forum, was that the focus was on the failures, right? I understand why. You focus on the elderly who are dying, the 5,000 that passed away, but what is sort of missed in all of this, right, is that because Sweden did not close the schools, right, this is a natural experiment, right? So one would think, right, that the Swedish experience with respect, to the schools would be of general interest, right, to other countries. And the fact there are two things that stand out here. One is, we do not see, any measurable negative effects, on children. And the second is that it's not true that teachers have been affected disproportionately in relationship to any other group of workers in Sweden. So there's very, very little in the way of evidence, right, of negative effects here on children. So, and that I think is very important to stress. And it also means, of course, that there's not that much of a worry or anxiety around, sending your kids back to school, and nor are teachers particularly worried about it. And I know this is a big issue in the US, so that's, just why I'm mentioning it.
Yeah, I mean, presumably too, your children are not being tested, so they could be asymptomatic carriers. But it's very interesting that you said there's been no particular incidents or increase in incidents among teachers. So yeah, basically, the idea that teachers are endangered is not really apparent.
No, and there's a big study coming out of Finland as well, Ed, showing the same thing. So, it was another study from Iceland, which was one of the first studies that was like, New England Journal of Medicine. So it was a very, very solid piece of research. And that looked also, at the question of spreading infections. And there just simply doesn't seem to be, a whole lot of evidence, certainly not from Scandinavia. Now, of course, doesn't mean that, it could be different elsewhere, right? I mean, don't forget here that we have a population, sort of the baseline health here is pretty high, right? So, children can be vulnerable too. They may be overweight, right? They may have other kinds of health issues, and then they may be, in fact, more vulnerable. So I'm not saying either. I mean, let's be clear here, right? I'm not suggesting, right, you just take the Swedish data or the Finnish data and just translate it in to US or any other country, because, you have to factor in, right, the particularities of the situation here at the level of health and how things are run. So I don't want to exaggerate, right, the relevance here, but if you look purely in Scandinavia itself, right, there's like no evidence really that this is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question here. On June 21st, it was reported that results of a study showing that COVID-19 infections were worse in nursing homes that used hourly workers. Mm-hmm. How much of the blame for the high death toll in Sweden's nursing homes can be ascribed to the privatization of nursing care in Sweden?
Yeah, well, this I think is a good question, first of all. And second, it feeds right into a kind of political debate in Sweden, right? Having to do with, let's say, introduction of free choice in the welfare sector at large, including both schools and elderly care, health care and so forth. Some of the people coming from the left, right, politically, they were quite quick, to sort of cast blame on the sort of private for-profit actors, suggesting that they were, trying to save money by, hiring people at the lower wages or not treating them well enough. And these were people who themselves needed a job and therefore, weren't likely to stay at home, even if they had some kind of symptoms. So there was a discussion like that. now some people argue that there is very little evidence of there being a big difference here, in terms of private and public. That public institutions have been just as good at failing as private institutions have. And I think ultimately this is a serious question that we need to take our time to do the proper research, right? But I think it's too early to demonize, private institutions. We need to be careful here, right? Before we start to cast blame. But clearly, there were instances. Remember too, it wasn't all Sweden, right? This was very, very localized, right? Some areas had bad experiences. Stockholm did, for example. Other parts of Sweden had virtually no, cases, right, where the elderly were hit. And so we need to study this much more carefully, and that is part of what's going on now in this big commission that was started in June, to look into what actually really happened, in a sense, day by day, and try to look to see exactly, what happened in those places where you had these clusters. But it's too early to answer that very important question in a definitive way.
Mm-hmm. Good, good. Okay, another question. If someone tests positive with no symptoms, are they required to self-isolate?
Well, it's not, it's interesting, the sort of notion of require, if you were to test positive, right, you are expected to use your brain, right, and stay at home, right, and indeed not expose others, to infection. Now, there, of course, are guidelines for that, right, so that, you have to show, if you show no symptoms, right, I can't forget now if it was 10 days or 2 weeks, after that, you're sort of free to return. But yes, indeed, there are guidelines for that.
Okay. And going back to the seniors, another question here. Can you talk about Sweden's approach to COVID with regard to seniors, how it has changed following other early public reactions? Has there been a change in the way senior care is is now performed?
You bet. I mean, this I think was a kind of a huge crisis in a way for Sweden, because Swedes, like other Scandinavians, like to pride themselves of taking care of people. So of course this was very painful, and so there's been a lot of efforts now and according, at least the data that I've seen recently coming out of the Swedish Health Authority, the care institutions now are doing very well. Of course, it doesn't help the people who passed away, but it's clearly this has been an area of enormous focus. And more recently now, the infections that we've seen in Sweden have been hitting more different age groups, right? Middle-aged people, more people in regular work situations who themselves have been much less vulnerable. So, and you see similar patterns elsewhere. Same thing throughout Europe, really. You see higher infection rates, in many European countries now, but it is not reflected in higher mortality rates. So we have a different situation. Some people even speculating, of course, that the virus is becoming nicer since it has a better chance to survive if it doesn't kill its host. So there's a lot of moving parts here, but the focus on the elderly care institutions has been enormous, and of course it has already changed sort of the daily routines and much stricter. And testing, of course, allows you in a different way now than before to actually ensure, right, that people are not going in with an infection.
Interesting. We were talking earlier about the borders with your neighbors, the other Nordic countries. Can you see any change in pan-Nordic relations after all of this? Do you think a certain chilliness has entered the picture? And is there a new effort at pan-Nordic cooperation or European cooperation? I remember when we spoke in May, you said there was very little cooperation within the EU in terms of response to a pandemic.
Yeah, very good questions, Ed. I mean, I think that, I'm more, in a sense, hopeful about the Nordic, situation, because Yes, it's true. There are tensions, no question about it. People are a little pissed off, and there's discussions and arguments. And Scandinavians may be nice, peaceful, and cooperative, but they are still also quite outspoken, right? So the Swedes have opinions about what's being done in Norway and Denmark, and it goes both ways, right? And the fact of the matter is that, from my perspective, we have things to learn from each other, and I think maybe I'm overly optimistic here, but I do think that there is enough goodwill here, accumulated over many, many years, that we will overcome, this brouhaha. Hopefully, what it will mean is that we will not again, end on a situation where there's a breakdown in the cooperation. Because remember, in the very beginning of the epidemic, right, there was lots of communication and agreements among the health authorities in the different countries. What happened then was, it's an interesting sort of historical development, is that in the other countries, right, the politicians intervened, right, and went in and sort of overruled, right, the advice of the health agencies themselves, that were less, prone to draconian measures. Right? And since Sweden sort of was left, alone, in taking that position. And that has to do with, the way like sort of politics and administration is sort of held separate in Sweden in a different way from the other countries. And this was unfortunate in that it sort of kind of set into a place, right, a period of competition, conflict, pointing fingers. And I think that is now, my sense is that will come to an end, right? We see a tendency towards convergence, right? The other Scandinavian countries are de facto opening up schools as well. Sweden, on the other hand, has much lower infection rates. So we see a process whereby, in a foreseeable future, right, you will see a Nordic zone that, is starting to look pretty similar, right? Both in terms of policies and in terms of outcomes. So there, I would be more hopeful, and I think, clearly Sweden has a lot to learn, but I think it goes both ways here. With respect to Europe, the big development has been this summer, right? With the German-France initiative to provide, a huge, package of assistance. And if you want to be optimistic, you can construe this, right? As a sort of famous idea that every crisis is an opportunity, right? So you can say that, the Germans finally decided to open up their wallets and be willing to think about the EU as a common tax project, right? Where you actually have a common budget based on taxation that can be used in the way that is being used now. So that could be, the beginning of a new era of cooperation within the EU. But on the other hand, right, we also see enduring divisions, and also a kind of a suspicion, I think, not least in the Nordic countries. If you look at Finland, Sweden, and Denmark and Holland, you can see a certain type of small state nationalism where they are not so enthusiastic about the idea of being ruled by Germany and France, right? So we certainly have lots of issues in the European Union to deal with, but hopefully this spirit of cooperation will also now translate into the two other big issues that are coming back now: migration and climate. And arguably those are bigger issues, right, than COVID. And so the question is, will COVID, provide the impetus, right, the opportunity for better cooperation around migration and environment and global warming? So these are questions. I certainly would not venture an answer at this point, but these are important things to watch, in the months and years to come.
Yeah, and this relates to a question that just one of our viewers sent in. Has Sweden's large immigrant population been affected more than the traditional population in proportion to the population size?
Yeah, there are two groups that sort of were discussed and have been discussed a lot. It's been the elderly and the immigrants, right? And here again, it's very interesting to see how this is going to translate, right? Because what happened was that There are neighborhoods, not least around here in Stockholm, immigrant neighborhoods that are poorer, segregated, and they are sort of problem areas, in many regards. And they were characterized then, of course, by people who are relatively newly arrived. Some of them couldn't speak Swedish or not very well. Some of them were living in much more dense living situations, right? So they were vulnerable in several ways, right, to the coronavirus, right? One, because of the density of kind of a family households, right, with several generations. So if the virus came in, then it could spread quickly in an environment. Some of them are also more religious than Swedes, right? So they may be congregating in a mosque or in a church, which we've seen throughout the world being like sort of super spreader events. So you have that. And then you had the kind of question about to what extent did Swedish politicians and the health authority communicate effectively the policies towards these immigrant groups, right? So there were arguments made that not enough of an effort was made to provide information in enough languages, right, to make sure, right, that the information reached people. So there was discussions about that. Was that like an aspect of some kind of a, not xenophobia perhaps, but a kind of a lack of attention, paid. On the plus side, I would say people who formerly may have just viewed a lot of these immigrants as, in some sense, problems, right? In terms of immigration and so forth in Sweden, now could also realize that they were human beings. They were dying like other people were, right? So they became also sort of objects for some type of empathy. So it kind of, in a way, shifted the discussion a little bit around integration and including, people in these communities in Swedish society. So in that sense, right, it may have actually prompted a more constructive discussion. We will see what happens with that. Now you see that normality has returned to Sweden. We have also gone back to debates that we had in February. And a lot of those right now in Sweden center around gang violence, clans, and other types of groups that are operating in these very areas, right? So it has actually triggered, again, debates about failed integration in Sweden, naive immigration policies. I get daily requests from Danish and Norwegian media now, because they, of course, watch Sweden here, viewing us as having been too liberal again, right? Liberal in terms of immigration and open borders. So the immigration question is going to be with us in so many different dimensions, and the corona epidemic is just one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you are, I'm sure, well aware, in the United States, we have suffered a crisis focusing on inequities within the society and inequalities, right, partially prompted by the pandemic. And this seems to be somewhat borne out in Sweden also. You're seeing a rise in this type of activity. You said riots and that type of thing? No. We haven't had anything like that. What we have had, and it's not really related to Corona. We've had a growth of criminal networks, right? That have been sort of based, right, in clan-like family structures in immigrant communities, right? And there have been incidents now of almost like occupying parts of cities like Gothenburg, having roadblocks, and a sense that the police does not no longer control, right, areas of the city, right? So this is not really related to Corona, right? This has been a budding problem that has been not visible maybe during the Corona crisis because everybody was focusing on that. But now we're sort of returning to ordinary politics. And the relationship here, I think, to the US is more in terms of Black Lives Matter movement, right? Sort of questions concerning racism, discrimination, unequal treatment, the relationship between police and these communities. So in that sense, right, the American debate around
Black Lives Matter has been more salient with respect to this than the COVID.
Right, right. Another question here. Could you share some thoughts on why rates seem to be so different across Europe? Do you think the lifestyle, density, or age of population in those areas plays any role? Is there any evidence for that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, of course, I think that there are questions about both culture and demographics that are important. I mean, clearly, in Northern Europe, you know, Scandinavian countries, perhaps not including Denmark, right? But if you look at Norway, Finland, Sweden, you know, you do not have high density populations, right? So social distancing is not so difficult to achieve. Right? And then you can possibly add the cultural element, you know, like there's a standing joke in Sweden right now, is that, you know, people can't wait that we drop this horrendous rule that we have to have a meter or two between each other. Everybody's longing to go back to the way it is normally, that we keep 4 meters distance. And of course, it's a, in a way, silly joke, but, you know, it tells you something, right, you know, about national stereotype. And so this is not something that's possible if you're in Belgium or if you're in the Netherlands, or even if you're in France or Italy or Spain. Right?
Spain, yes.
Yeah. So you have, you know, and then, but then I would add here, and here perhaps comes to like some sort of defense of the Swedish strategy, right? That is to say that what you've had going on in Southern Europe in particular, if you look at France, Spain, very draconian policies, right? You know, kids have not been able to go out. Yeah. Shops have been closed. Yeah. You've been threatening people with fines. You have to papers to prove that you can, you know, have to go shopping and things of the sort. So of course you have a pent up, right, need and desire to socialize. And, you know, in countries that, at least according to national stereotypes, are very social on top of it, right? You know, where you have a long tradition of going out for dinners in the city and so forth. So, I mean, it seems that the combination, right, of a backlash against lockdown policies and kind of general tendencies in the culture and being high density, you know, populations, you know, that seems to be a recipe for a second wave, one might argue. So that I'm surely plays in here, but, you know, I am not an expert on this, so, you know, I'm just simply speculating, probably in the same way that you could around that, but it seems at least kind of plausible.
Right. Well, I think one final question, and this just came in. How would you characterize the media coverage internally about COVID-19 over this time? Has there been much of a backlash against the strategy adopted by the scientists and the experts and authorities?
Yeah, that's been a lively debate. I mean, I usually describe it that we haven't had any of the political polarization that you've had in the US, right? So you take an issue like masks, for example. It's largely a non-issue in Sweden, right? You know, in the US, as you well know, right, wearing a mask in some communities is a signal that you are a Democrat, right? You know, and not wearing a mask, you know, waving a Swedish flag suggests that you are a Republican libertarian. And so this kind of signaling, right, and polarization, same thing with schools, right? You know, when Trump went out and said, you know, we should go back to schools, some Democrats, you know, more or less reacted by saying that if Trump says so, surely we should not do it, right? So, we haven't had that here. It's been very, very calm in that regard. But the conflicts that we have had have been very much in the media. So you've had a very vocal group, is a small group, but it's still a vocal group of some groups of the so-called 22 scientists that were active in writing very critical articles early on. You've had a fair number of pundits, right, writing in editorial pages and so forth, who also have been up in arms, you know, about the Swedish policy. Now that has died down, right, you know, because as you know, everything has calmed down here, and now I think it's shifted the same way the international coverage has shifted, right? So now the last 2 weeks I'm getting all these international media contacting me again, but now they're asking very different questions, right? Yeah, now the questions are more like, you know, okay, so what are you guys doing right? You know, before it was, you know, why are you killing everybody? So it's shifted, and we see that also in the domestic debate, right? So it's much calmer And I think it's a more constructive discussion, right? Because you do not see kind of a celebration. Oh, we're home free. You know, we cured everybody. Everything is okay. It's much more a kind of, let's be careful. Let's focus on what we can do. Let's try to have, you know, very specific type of policies addressing real issues. You know, a good example is the question of masks, right? You know, I mean, some foreign observers coming here say, why don't you wear a mask? I said, well, that's not quite true. You know, I just went up and down from Skåne to Stockholm, and everybody wears a mask on an airplane. You know, it seems to make perfect sense to do that in an airplane. We may well see, I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if we have any local outbreaks in Stockholm, that we're going to ask people to wear masks, let's say in subways or in buses. So there is a kind of a pragmatism and you know, thinking along the lines of being more open, right, to a specific problem, solutions to specific problems. So it's not a kind of a polarized discussion where there's a lot of feeling about it. You know, it's more trying to stay calm, right, which has been a great virtue here, by the way, Ed. You know, the one thing that all of the visitors coming here say, that it's so nice to come to Sweden from elsewhere in Europe right now, because it just seems much more relaxed. You know, people come here and you can breathe more easily. It's not the sense of sort of a panic that sort of has a grip on society. And that also allows, I think, for a more nuanced discussion about, you know, where do we go next? And I bet you we're going to have more outbreaks here. We're going to see challenges coming up ahead. You know, it's not over here. And we're going to have setbacks, you know, but I feel pretty good right now that there is a kind of a willingness, you know, to move forward now, and we are better prepared. You know, we have better testing, we have more protection in elderly care. So, you know, the basic conditions are so much better than they were, you know, back in the early spring.
Yeah, I think they are. But back in the early spring, I don't know that we realized it was going to go quite as long as it has gone, or looks like it's going to go.
No.
It's a constantly unfolding story, which leads to a great deal of uncertainty, I think, at times. But it's great to see you again, Lars, and I think it's about time to close off. But any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, I just wish you guys all the best in the U.S. I've been very happy to see that things have been improving a lot in New York, where you are, and I'm in close touch with my friends. You know, a big part of my heart, you know, is very much either in New York or in San Francisco. I've lived 40 years in the U.S., so I care a lot about what's happening in the U.S. and I've been very, very, very worried, I have to say. You know, not just about COVID, but you know, about polarization generally politically in the U.S. as well. So, you know, I just wish you guys all the best, you know, and you know, I know you're going in now to election period as well. So it's a time of lots of challenges in the U.S. So, you know, I really wish you all the best, you know, on all those counts.
Well, I appreciate that as a New Yorker, and I must tell you, New York is looking much better than it did, and I admire all New Yorkers who have been following all of the guidelines very well.
Yeah.
And I'm a native San Franciscan. I share your concern there. They've gotten through the most recent fires, but we're looking at more threats in the future. So,
the fires have been horrible. Yeah. But I'm proud of New York too, and I'm not surprised. You know, I remember when I lived in New York, and I don't know if you remember, there was this big power outage. You know,
we've had a few, yes.
2002 or something like that. And I remember driving through Manhattan. I just arrived from Sweden. It was in August, I think, late, you know. And I came through, and I remember seeing New York City just transforming itself, right, to a well-functioning civil society where, you know, people were helping each other, being respectful, very impressive, you know. So in that sense, I think actually New York and Sweden are not so unlike. You know, I mean, people are capable of taking responsibility, and we have to work with these things at the individual level. You know, we can't sit around waiting for the state to solve all of the problems. You know, we have to be in it together, and I think New Yorkers are really good at that too.
I agree. It's great. Well, listen, this has been a terrific hour. Once again, it's illuminating and enjoyable and great to see you. And I hope we can do it again when we have further news to report. All good news, I hope, the next time. I'd like to thank all of our viewers for being with us, and this will go on to our YouTube channel, so if you have friends who haven't been able to see it, it will be available within the next few days. ASF is presenting a number of programs in the near future, and I hope you'll take a chance to look at them. On September 30th, we're having a panel on policing and police reform in the Nordic countries, hosted by Vanessa Barker, a friend of Lars. And that is on September 30th. 5 days before that, on this Friday, there will be the interview with Lena Olin, the great Swedish actress, prior to our showing of her newest film, The Artist's Wife. This will be available for 2 weeks through ASF. Just go to our newsletter to link into that. And on September 29th, we will begin a month-long series on Nordic literature entitled Nordic Authors You Should Know. And each episode of this will focus on the literature of a different country and discuss several contemporary artists as seen by their translators, which should be quite interesting. We hope you'll be there for us. We have many other programs going on, particularly a lot of programs for children. And so take a look at our newsletter at our website and join up for everything. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Lars. Thank you to the team who worked on this, Laurie Fredrickson and Kyle Reinhardt, and all of the ASF staff. And I'd also like to thank our funders, most specifically for this program, the Barbara Osher Pro Suecia Foundation and the Carlson Fund. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Lars.
Bye.
Thank you.